Autumn 1940. The North Atlantic. The grey waters churned beneath a convoy of merchant ships pushing eastward through the growing darkness. Captain Louis Mountbatten stood on the bridge of his destroyer, scanning the horizon as the sun dropped toward the western edge of the world. One ship disappeared first, not sinking, not retreating, simply vanishing into the twilight, while every other vessel remained visible against the darkening sky. That ship was painted lavender-mauve-grey, and in that moment of observation, Mountbatten conceived an idea that would become one of the war's most controversial camouflage experiments. The vessel that caught Mountbatten's attention was a Union Castle liner, still wearing its pre-war hull color. While standard battleship grey destroyers and merchant vessels remained clearly visible in the fading light, this single ship seemed to dissolve into the atmosphere itself. The phenomenon was optical, yes, but it was also tactical. Dawn and dusk were the most dangerous hours for naval vessels. German U-boats preferred to attack during these transitional periods when visibility favored the hunter. Aircraft could strike during these windows when ships were silhouetted against brightening or dimming skies. The ability to disappear during these critical minutes could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Mountbatten was no ordinary naval officer. Born into royalty as the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, he carried connections that reached into the highest levels of British command. But he was also a man who understood modern warfare required innovation. As Captain D commanding the 5th Destroyer Flotilla, he had already experienced the brutal reality of naval combat. His flagship HMS Kenya had struck a mine in December 1939, requiring 3 months of repairs. The ship would be torpedoed again in May 1940, nearly sinking. Half his crew would die before the war ended. This was a man who knew survival was not guaranteed by tradition or protocol. It required every advantage technology and ingenuity could provide. The context of 1940 cannot be overstated. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen in June. The Low Countries were occupied. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities nightly during the Blitz. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun, with German U-boats sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. Every tactical innovation, no matter how small, represented a potential advantage in a war Britain was losing. The Royal Navy faced unprecedented challenges. The service had entered the war with traditions stretching back centuries, but those traditions were being tested against modern weapons and tactics. Submarines could strike from below, aircraft could attack from above, surface raiders could emerge from fog or darkness with devastating speed. The comfortable assumptions of naval warfare no longer applied. Officers like Mountbatten understood this reality viscerally. They had seen ships sink, they had lost friends, they knew that conventional thinking would lead to conventional defeat. Upon returning to port, Mountbatten examined the phenomenon he had witnessed. The Union Castle liner's color was medium lavender mauve-grey. Nothing exotic, nothing extraordinary, just a shade that happened to match the sky at dawn and dusk when the sun was near the horizon but not yet visible, tinting the atmosphere in subtle pinks and purples. This was the period naval officers called the magic hour, the time when visual deception became possible. The science behind this observation was rooted in atmospheric optics. When the sun approaches the horizon, its light must travel through increasingly thick layers of atmosphere. Blue light scatters more readily than red light, a phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering. This is why the sky appears blue during midday. But at dawn and dusk, with the sun at extreme angles, much of the blue light scatters away entirely. The remaining light carries warmer tones: reds, oranges, pinks, purples. The sky itself becomes a canvas of these colors for brief periods. A ship painted to match these tones would theoretically blend with the sky when viewed against it. This was fundamentally different from traditional camouflage concepts. Most military camouflage attempts to blend with the ground or surrounding terrain. Naval camouflage had focused on confusing observation rather than preventing it. Dazzle schemes used contrasting geometric patterns to make it difficult to determine a ship's course and speed, but Mountbatten was proposing something else entirely. He wanted his ships to become temporarily invisible during the most dangerous hours of naval operations. The tactical implications were profound. Consider a U-boat commander searching for convoy targets at dawn. He surfaces to scan the horizon with binoculars. The sky is brightening in the east, tinted pink and purple by the approaching sun. Against this backdrop, grey ships stand out clearly. but a ship painted in matching tones might delay detection by crucial minutes. Those minutes could allow escort vessels to close distance and force the submarine to dive. They could allow the convoy to alter course and escape. They could mean the difference between successful attack and frustrated withdrawal. Mountbatten ordered immediate tests. He wanted his entire flotilla repainted. The color would be medium grey, specifically Admiralty designation 507B, with a small amount of Venetian red mixed in. The red tint produced a distinctive shade that observers would never forget once they saw it. This wasn't camouflage in the traditional sense. It wasn't about blending into the ocean or breaking up a ship's outline. It was about matching the sky during those critical transitional periods when attacks were most likely. The chemistry was straightforward but required precision. Venetian red is an iron oxide pigment that has been used since antiquity. It provides a warm, earthy red tone that, when mixed with grey, creates a color that shifts between pink and mauve depending on lighting conditions. The exact proportions mattered enormously. Too much red and the ships would appear obviously pink even in broad daylight. Too little and the color would be indistinguishable from standard grey, defeating the purpose entirely. Paint manufacturers had to source materials and produce consistent batches. Venetian red came from processed iron oxide, which had to be ground to precise particle sizes and mixed with binding agents. The medium grey base required its own careful formulation. Titanium white, carbon black, and various extenders combined to create the neutral base tone. Quality control became essential. Each batch had to match the specification exactly, or ships would appear different colors, creating a non-uniform fleet that would draw attention rather than avoid it. By early 1941, several destroyers of the 5th Flotilla wore the new color. No formal testing had been conducted, no scientific studies validated the approach. Mountbatten believed in what he had observed, and he had the authority to act on that belief. Other captains noticed. Some adopted the same camouflage, either because they trusted Mountbatten's judgment or because they wanted to align themselves with a well-connected officer. The color spread through the fleet, not through official directive, but through informal adoption. The social dynamics within the Royal Navy influenced this adoption pattern. The service operated on strict hierarchical principles, but it also had informal networks of influence. Officers who had served together, who shared common backgrounds, who trusted each other's judgment. Mountbatten occupied a unique position in these networks. His royal connections gave him visibility. His combat experience gave him credibility. His willingness to innovate gave him a reputation as someone thinking seriously about winning the war, rather than simply following established procedures. The sailors called it Mountbatten Pink. Some also referred to it as Plymouth Pink, after the naval base where many of these ships were stationed. The name carried both affection and skepticism. Pink was not a color associated with warships. Grey conveyed power, authority, menace. Pink suggested something else entirely, frivolity perhaps, unmanliness even. But the crews who sailed on ships painted this color became fierce advocates. They believed it worked. They believed it saved lives. This belief mattered more than historians sometimes acknowledge. Naval combat in the Second World War was psychologically devastating. Sailors faced threats they couldn't see and couldn't fight directly. A torpedo could strike without warning. A bomb could fall from aircraft too high to engage. A mine could detonate beneath the hull with no possibility of evasion. In this environment, anything that provided a sense of protection, even psychological protection, had value. If sailors believed their pink paint made them harder to detect, they operated with greater confidence. That confidence influenced their performance in countless subtle ways. The chemistry of the paint was straightforward. Medium grey provided the base. Venetian red, an iron oxide pigment, added the pink tint. The result was a color that appeared grey in some lights and distinctly pink in others. Under the right conditions, specifically during dawn and dusk when the sky took on similar tones, the ships seemed to vanish, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to delay visual detection by critical seconds or minutes. The application process required careful preparation. Ship hulls had to be cleaned of rust, salt deposits, and previous paint layers. Primers were applied to ensure adhesion. Multiple coats of the pink mixture followed, with each coat requiring time to cure properly. The work was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Destroyers couldn't be spared from operations for extended periods, so painting often occurred during brief port visits or between missions. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to complete the work as quickly as possible. The tactical application required understanding the operational environment. Naval combat in 1940 and 1941 relied heavily on visual observation. Radar existed but remained primitive. The British had developed chain-home radar stations for detecting aircraft, and some naval vessels carried early radar sets, but these systems were unreliable and had limited resolution. Surface vessels detected each other primarily through lookouts scanning the horizon with binoculars. Aircraft spotted targets visually before making attack runs. Submarines surfaced to identify and track convoys. In this environment, any delay in visual detection provided tactical advantage. Consider the geometry of naval engagement. A destroyer traveling at 30 knots covers approximately 1,500 feet per minute. If Mountbatten Pink delayed visual detection by even 2 minutes, the ship gained half a mile of unobserved movement. That could mean the difference between establishing firing position and missing the opportunity entirely. For a convoy under submarine attack, 2 minutes of invisibility could allow escorts to close the distance and force the U-boat to dive before achieving firing solution. But the mathematics became more complex when examined in detail. Visual detection range depended on countless variables: the height of the observer's position, the clarity of the atmosphere, the size and type of vessel being observed, sea state, and whether waves obscured the target, the contrast between the target and its background. Mounting pink might reduce contrast during dawn and dusk, but how much? And how did that reduction translate into increased detection range? The concept had precedent. Artists and scientists had been studying camouflage since the First World War. Dazzle camouflage used geometric patterns to confuse range finding and obscure a ship's heading. Countershading used lighter colors on lower surfaces to counteract the effects of overhead illumination, but Mountbatten's approach was different. He was attempting to match the environment itself, specifically the sky, during transitional lighting conditions. The First World War had seen extensive experimentation with naval camouflage. Norman Wilkinson, a British marine painter, had developed dazzle camouflage in 1917. His designs used bold geometric patterns in contrasting colors. The patterns didn't hide ships, they made them more visible, but they confused visual ranging. A submarine commander looking through a periscope struggled to determine which direction the dazzled ship was heading and at what speed. This uncertainty delayed the firing solution and reduced hit probability. By some estimates, dazzled ships were 40% less likely to be sunk than conventionally painted vessels. Mountbatten Pink represented a different philosophy. Instead of confusing observation, it attempted to delay detection. The ship would remain invisible, or nearly invisible, until it closed to effective range. Then it would appear suddenly, already in position to engage. This approach required precise understanding of lighting conditions and careful timing of operations. It worked brilliantly when conditions aligned. It failed completely when they didn't. The challenge lay in the narrow operational window. Dawn and dusk each lasted perhaps 30 to 40 minutes in northern latitudes during winter months, longer during summer, but still a small fraction of each day. During these periods, the sky displayed the pink and purple tones that Mountbatten Pink attempted to match. But outside these periods, during full daylight or complete darkness, the color provided no advantage. In fact, it potentially created disadvantages by making ships more visible against the ocean or against the night sky. The Crown Colony class cruiser received the distinctive paint scheme and earned the nickname the Pink Lady. Kenya was a powerful vessel, carrying 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, 8 4-inch anti-aircraft guns, and multiple smaller weapons. She displaced over 8,000 tons and could make 31 knots. She was designed for extended operations in distant waters with good range and seaworthiness. In short, she was exactly the type of vessel that needed every tactical advantage when operating in hostile waters. The decision to paint Kenya in Mountbatten Pink reflected both the spread of the concept and the ongoing debate about its effectiveness. His officers and crew supported it. The ship's operational profile involved convoy escort and raid support, missions where dawn and dusk attacks were likely. The pink paint seemed appropriate for her missions. But it also made Kenya highly visible and recognizable. In a fleet of grey ships, the pink cruiser stood out conspicuously. This raised questions about whether the camouflage was actually concealing anything or simply marking the ship as different. On December 27, 1941, Kenya led the naval force supporting Operation Archery, a commando raid against German installations on Vårgøy Island off the Norwegian coast. The operation required the fleet to approach the Norwegian coast in darkness and commence bombardment at dawn. Timing was critical. The commandos needed surprise. The ships needed to deliver accurate fire support while minimizing their own exposure to coastal batteries. The planning for Operation Archery had begun weeks earlier. The Combined Operations Headquarters, under Lord Louis Mountbatten's command, had been conducting increasingly ambitious raids against German-occupied territory. These operations served multiple purposes. They tied down German forces who had to guard long coastlines. They gathered intelligence and captured enemy equipment. They provided experience for the growing commando forces. And they demonstrated to the British public and Allied partners that Britain was still fighting aggressively, despite being unable to launch a cross-channel invasion. Vårgøy was selected for specific reasons. The island hosted German coastal batteries, communications facilities, and a garrison. More importantly, it was a center for processing fish oil, which the Germans used in the manufacture of explosives. Destroying these facilities would disrupt German war production while demonstrating British capability to strike targets in occupied Norway. The Norwegian government in exile strongly supported the operation, seeing it as proof that their country had not been forgotten. Rear Admiral Harold Burrow commanded the naval force. Kenya was his flagship. Accompanying her were destroyers, HMS Onslow, Oribi, Offa, and Chiddingfold. The submarine HMS Tuna served as a navigational marker. Landing ships, Prince Charles and Prince Leopold, carried the commando troops. The force sailed from Scapa Flow on December 26, timing their approach to arrive off the Norwegian coast at dawn on December 27. As Kenya and her escorts approached the Norwegian coast, the sky began to lighten. The date was carefully chosen. December 27 offered short daylight hours this far north. But those dawn minutes remained dangerous. German coastal guns could engage at long range if they detected the approaching fleet. The weather cooperated. The forecast had been uncertain, with possibilities of heavy weather that would force cancellation, but conditions moderated as the fleet crossed the North Sea. By the time they reached Norwegian waters, the sea was relatively calm. Visibility was good, but not excessive. A thin layer of cloud diffused the dawn light, creating exactly the kind of atmospheric conditions where Mountbatten Pink theoretically worked best. At approximately 0845 hours, Kenya opened fire. Her 6-inch guns began hammering German positions on Marloy Island. The bombardment was devastating, 400 shells in less than 10 minutes. The sound was tremendous, a continuous rolling thunder that echoed off the Norwegian mountains. The German defenders had minimal warning. They had not seen the British ships approaching through the dawn twilight. Whether Mountbatten Pink contributed to this delayed detection remains debated, but the operation succeeded. The commandos went ashore, destroyed their objectives, and withdrew with acceptable casualties. The commandos of No. 3 Commando and No. 2 Commando stormed ashore in American-made Higgins landing craft. These boats had been supplied through the Lend-Lease program, representing the growing American material support for Britain even before the United States entered the war. The commandos faced immediate and fierce resistance. German troops had recovered from the initial bombardment and were fighting from prepared positions. The battle for the town of Vårgøy lasted several hours, with house-to-house fighting and multiple casualties on both sides. Captain Martin Linge, leading Norwegian troops alongside the British commandos, was killed during the assault on a German strongpoint. His death became symbolic of Norwegian resistance and sacrifice. The Norwegian forces under British command were volunteers who had escaped occupation and were fighting to liberate their homeland. Their participation in operations like Archery was as much political as military, demonstrating continued Norwegian resistance despite occupation. During the engagement, German coastal batteries eventually found the range and began firing at Kenya. The guns were positioned on Rugsundøy Island, well protected and capable of engaging at extended ranges. The shells landed close. Some accounts suggest the pink camouflage created an unexpected benefit. The Germans were using shells with pink marker dye to help spotters observe where rounds landed. Against a grey ship, these pink splashes would be clearly visible. Against a pink ship, they became harder to distinguish. German spotters struggled to differentiate between shell splashes and the ship itself. Kenya took several near misses but sustained only minor damage. This detail, if accurate, represents one of the most intriguing aspects of the Mountbatten Pink story. The idea that German marker dye accidentally matched British camouflage seems almost too convenient to be true. Yet multiple sources reference it, and it appears in official reports. The German use of coloured marker dyes was standard practice. Different batteries used different colours to help spotting teams identify which shells belonged to which gun. Pink was one of the standard colours. That it happened to match the colour of a British cruiser represents either remarkable coincidence or evidence of the colour's effectiveness. Whether entirely accurate or embellished, it captured the imagination of crews who sailed on pink ships. They believed the colour saved them. They saw enemy shells fall nearby without achieving hits and credited the camouflage. This belief mattered. Morale in naval combat required confidence in one's ship and equipment. If sailors believed Mountbatten Pink protected them, they fought with greater determination. But skepticism existed within the Admiralty. Camouflage experts analysed the concept and found it wanting. Their analysis was thorough and damning. Mountbatten Pink might offer marginal benefits during dawn and dusk, but it created serious problems during midday hours. When the sun climbed above the horizon and the sky turned blue, pink ships stood out conspicuously against the ocean. Traditional battleship grey blended better with the water under full daylight conditions. Since most naval operations occurred during daylight hours, this was not a minor concern. The Admiralty's camouflage section had been studying naval camouflage scientifically since the First World War. They employed artists, physicists, and naval officers to develop and test various schemes. Their work was methodical and evidence-based. They conducted observations under controlled conditions. They photographed ships painted in various schemes under different lighting conditions and at different ranges. They analyzed the results to determine which approaches actually reduced detection range or confused observation. Their conclusion regarding Mountbatten Pink was unequivocal. The color provided minimal benefit during its theoretical operational window and created significant disadvantages during other periods. The scientific analysis was clear. Human color perception operates differently under different lighting conditions. The Purkinje effect describes how the eye's sensitivity shifts between cone-based vision in bright light and rod-based vision in darkness. During twilight, both systems operate simultaneously, creating complex and variable color perception. The science supported the critics. Human color perception changes with light levels. The Purkinje effect describes how the eye's sensitivity shifts between photopic vision in bright light and scotopic vision in darkness. During twilight, when both types of vision operate simultaneously, color perception becomes unreliable. Pink might blend with a pink sky, but it might also appear darker or lighter depending on countless variables. Cloud cover, humidity, atmospheric haze, the precise angle of the sun. Each factor influenced whether Mountbatten Pink provided camouflage or made ships more visible. Mathematical analysis suggested Mountbatten Pink was, at best, equivalent to neutral grey during dawn and dusk. At worst, it made ships more conspicuous during the majority of operational hours. The tactical window for effective camouflage was perhaps 30 minutes at dawn and 30 minutes at dusk. That represented perhaps 7% of a 24-hour period. For the remaining 93%, pink ships were potentially more vulnerable. The human eye adapts to ambient light levels continuously. In bright sunlight, the pupils constrict and cone cells dominate vision, providing color discrimination and high acuity. In darkness, pupils dilate and rod cells dominate, providing light sensitivity but poor color discrimination. During twilight, this transition occurs gradually, with both systems active. The result is that color perception during twilight is fundamentally different from color perception during full daylight. A color that appears to match the sky during one phase of twilight might appear completely wrong minutes later as light levels continue to change. Field experience supported this analysis. Ship captains reported mixed results. Some believed the camouflage worked brilliantly, others saw no benefit. The lack of controlled testing made objective assessment impossible. Ships painted pink operated alongside ships painted grey. Both types engaged in similar missions. Both types survived or didn't survive based on countless factors. Enemy action, tactical decisions, weather conditions, mechanical reliability, crew competence. Isolating the impact of paint color proved impossible under combat conditions. A refinement emerged in 1941. Some ships adopted a two-tone scheme using slightly lighter pink on upper structures. The theory suggested this would better match the lighter upper sky while maintaining darker tones lower down. This approach drew on countershading principles that had been studied extensively. Animals in nature often display this pattern, with lighter coloring on their undersides to counteract the shadowing effect of overhead light. Applied to ships, the concept suggested that a gradient from darker pink near the waterline to lighter pink on upper structures would better match the vertical gradient of the sky. Whether this improved effectiveness remained unclear. Anecdotal reports were positive, but no empirical data existed to validate the approach. The two-tone scheme required more complex application, with careful masking to create clean transitions between shades. This increased the time and cost of painting, while providing uncertain benefits. Some ships adopted it anyway, suggesting that commanders were willing to try any refinement that might improve their chances of survival. The United States Navy took notice. American naval observers studied British camouflage experiments with interest. The U.S. Navy had its own camouflage research program, testing various schemes under different conditions. At least one American ship, the destroyer USS Winslow, received a pink paint scheme similar to Mountbatten's design. The results mirrored British experience. Some officers believed it worked. Others remained skeptical. The color created controversy in the American fleet, just as it had in the Royal Navy. USS Winslow's adoption of pink camouflage reflected the broader information sharing between Allied navies. British and American officers exchanged technical data, tactical observations, and operational experiences. This collaboration accelerated innovation for both navies, allowing each to learn from the other's experiments without duplicating efforts. But it also meant that questionable innovations like Mountbatten Pink spread beyond their original context, consuming resources in multiple navies. The German Kriegsmarine conducted parallel experiments. Intelligence reports indicated German vessels tested light pink shades during 1943 and 1944. A Royal Navy interrogation of crew from S-147, a German E-boat sunk in the English Channel in April 1944, revealed that their vessel had been painted pale pink. The Germans apparently reached similar conclusions about dawn and dusk camouflage, but they also abandoned the approach, suggesting they encountered the same problems the British discovered. This parallel development is fascinating from a historical perspective. It suggests that the basic observation about atmospheric optics and color matching was not unique to Mountbatten. German naval officers made similar observations and drew similar conclusions. The fact that both sides tested pink camouflage and both sides eventually abandoned it provides strong evidence that the concept, while theoretically sound, was practically limited. By the end of 1942, all Royal Navy vessels of destroyer size and larger had discontinued Mountbatten Pink. The decision came from the Admiralty, overriding Mountbatten's preferences. The official position was diplomatic but firm. The color provided no proven advantage and potentially increased vulnerability during daylight hours. Ships returned to standard battleship grey or adopted newer camouflage schemes based on more sophisticated research. The decision reflected broader changes in naval warfare technology. By late 1942, radar was becoming more reliable and more common. Surface vessels increasingly detected each other electronically rather than visually. Aircraft used radar to locate targets in darkness or poor visibility. The tactical importance of visual camouflage was declining. This didn't mean visual detection was irrelevant, but it meant that the marginal benefits of specialized camouflage schemes were becoming less significant compared to electronic countermeasures and other technologies. Smaller vessels retained pink camouflage longer. Motor torpedo boats, motor gun boats, and other coastal craft continued using the color into 1944. These vessels operated primarily at night and during twilight hours. Their tactical profile matched Mountbatten Pink's theoretical advantages. They needed to approach enemy positions under cover of darkness, attack during twilight, and withdraw before full daylight exposed them. For these missions, the brief period of effective camouflage justified the daylight vulnerability. These smaller craft operated in coastal waters where visual detection remained critically important. They attacked enemy convoys, engaged in anti-submarine warfare, and supported commando operations. Their operations typically lasted only a few hours, timed to take maximum advantage of darkness and twilight. For these vessels, spending 60 minutes of their mission with enhanced camouflage justified the risk during other periods when they would be withdrawing to friendly waters anyway. The broader history of naval camouflage provides context. Navies had struggled with the visual detection problem since ships first carried guns. Sail-powered warships were painted in colors that supposedly made them less visible. Black hulls and yellow stripes supposedly confused distance estimation. The introduction of steel hulls and modern gunnery created new requirements. Ships needed to be difficult to see at long ranges. They needed to confuse enemy range-finding equipment. They needed to obscure their type and heading. During the First World War, dazzle camouflage emerged as the dominant approach. Ships received elaborate geometric patterns in contrasting colors. These patterns didn't hide ships. They made them more visible. But they confused visual observation. An enemy commander looking through a periscope or rangefinder struggled to determine which direction the ship was heading and how fast it was moving. This delayed firing solutions and reduced hit probability. The effectiveness of dazzle camouflage was debated throughout its use. Proponents pointed to statistical analysis showing that dazzled ships were sunk less frequently than conventionally painted ships. Critics argued that the statistics were unreliable and that other factors explained the differences. The debate was never fully resolved, partly because controlled experiments were impossible during wartime, and partly because the advent of radar made the question increasingly irrelevant. Mountbatten Pink represented a different philosophy. Instead of confusing observation, it attempted to delay detection. The ship would remain invisible or nearly invisible until it closed to effective range. Then it would appear suddenly, already in position to engage. This approach required precise understanding of lighting conditions and careful timing of operations. It worked brilliantly when conditions aligned. It failed completely when they didn't. The psychology of camouflage mattered as much as the physics. Sailors needed to believe their ship was protected. This confidence influenced their performance in combat. If crew members thought their pink paint made them invisible, they operated more boldly. They took calculated risks they might otherwise avoid. This could produce better tactical results, even if the camouflage provided no actual benefit. Conversely, if crews doubted their camouflage, they operated more cautiously, potentially missing opportunities. Mountbatten understood this psychological dimension intuitively. He was not simply a technically minded officer implementing a scientific solution. He was a leader who understood that belief and morale were weapons as important as guns and torpedoes. He visited ships wearing his pink scheme and spoke with crews. He told them the color would protect them. He shared stories of enemy attacks that failed because ships vanished into the twilight. He built confidence through personal presence and force of personality. Whether the science supported his claims mattered less than whether his sailors believed them. This aspect of leadership is often overlooked in technical histories. We focus on what worked or didn't work mechanically, forgetting that human beings operated these machines and that their psychology influenced outcomes. A crew that believed they were protected operated their ship differently than a crew that felt vulnerable. They made bolder tactical decisions. They maintained composure under fire. They persevered through difficult moments. These intangible factors could be as important as any technical advantage. The production of Mountbatten Pink paint involved industrial coordination. Naval dockyards needed to manufacture the specific pigment mixture in sufficient quantities. Paint manufacturers had to source Venetian red and mix it precisely with medium grey. Quality control became essential. If the mixture varied between batches, ships would appear different colors. This would defeat the purpose entirely. The Admiralty established specifications and oversight procedures to ensure consistency. The industrial aspects of warfare are often invisible in combat narratives, but they fundamentally shaped what was possible. Britain in 1940 faced severe industrial constraints. Factories were converting from peacetime to wartime production. Materials were in short supply. Labor was scarce as men enlisted in the military. Every decision about allocating industrial resources involved trade-offs. producing specialized paint pigments for Mountbatten Pink meant not producing something else. Those opportunity costs had to be justified by demonstrable military benefits. Application presented its own challenges. Ships required repainting every few months. Salt water, weather, and combat damage degraded paint rapidly. Maintenance crews had to prepare surfaces, apply multiple coats, and ensure even coverage. This work occurred in naval dockyards and sometimes at sea. The distinctive color made touch-up work obvious. Any grey patch on a pink hull stood out conspicuously. This created pressure for frequent complete repaints, consuming resources and dockyard capacity. A destroyer required approximately 400 gallons of paint for a complete repainting. Larger vessels like Kenya required far more. Each repainting took several days of dockyard time, during which the ship was unavailable for operations. Multiply this across dozens of vessels, and the resource consumption became substantial. The Admiralty had to weigh these costs against uncertain tactical benefits. The economic calculation was straightforward. Paint cost money, labor cost money, dockyard time represented opportunity cost since ships being repainted weren't conducting operations. If Mountbatten Pink provided marginal or no advantage, these costs were unjustified. The Admiralty had to allocate limited resources efficiently. Spending money on pink paint meant not spending it on ammunition, fuel, maintenance, or other priorities. The decision to discontinue the color reflected this economic reality as much as tactical considerations. Britain's financial situation in 1940 and 1941 was desperate. The country was effectively bankrupt, sustained only by American credit and material support through Lend-Lease. Every pound spent had to produce military value. Waste was not merely inefficient, it was potentially catastrophic. The Admiralty's decision-makers understood this context. Their responsibility was not just to fight effectively, but to fight economically, maximizing military output from limited resources. Photographic documentation of Mountbatten Pink ships is limited. Most wartime photography was black and white. Pink and grey appeared nearly identical in monochrome images. Color photography existed but was expensive and rare. A few color photographs and film footage captured pink ships, but these materials were not widely distributed. This created an interesting historical situation, a highly visible innovation that paradoxically left little visual record. The scarcity of color photographs creates challenges for historians attempting to reconstruct what these ships actually looked like. We have descriptions, paint specifications, and anecdotal accounts. But seeing the ships as contemporary observers saw them remains difficult. The few surviving color images show ships that appear purplish-grey, distinctly different from standard battleship grey, but perhaps less dramatically pink than the name suggests. Veterans who served on pink ships remembered the color vividly. Decades after the war, they could describe the exact shade. They recalled how it looked under different lighting conditions. They shared stories of moments when they believed the camouflage saved their lives. These personal testimonies provide valuable historical evidence, though they cannot resolve the question of actual effectiveness. Oral histories collected from veterans in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s consistently emphasize the emotional connection these sailors felt to their pink ships. They described the color with pride, defending it against criticism even when presented with evidence of its limited effectiveness. This loyalty transcended rational analysis. It reflected deeper bonds formed during shared danger and shared purpose. The pink paint became a symbol of their service, their sacrifice, and their survival. The legacy of Mountbatten Pink extends beyond its military application. The color became a cultural artifact. It represented innovation, willingness to challenge convention, and the sometimes chaotic nature of technological development during wartime. It demonstrated that even high-ranking officers with royal connections couldn't impose solutions without eventual scrutiny. It showed that belief in a technology could be as important as the technology itself. In post-war years, Mountbatten Pink became a footnote in naval history, referenced in memoirs and histories as an interesting but ultimately unsuccessful experiment. Some accounts treated it with gentle mockery, emphasizing the absurdity of pink warships. Others defended it as a reasonable attempt to gain tactical advantage under desperate circumstances. The story persisted because it contained elements that resonated with broader themes of wartime innovation and human ingenuity. Modern naval forces rarely use visual camouflage. Radar, satellite surveillance, and other electronic detection methods make color schemes largely irrelevant. Ships are painted grey for tradition and practicality, not for tactical concealment. The problems Mountbatten tried to solve no longer exist in the same form, but the underlying challenge remains. How do military forces gain advantage through deception, confusion, or delayed detection? The methods change, but the objective persists. Contemporary stealth technology represents the modern equivalent of Mountbatten Pink. Instead of matching the visual background, stealth aircraft and ships attempt to minimize their radar cross-section, infrared signature, and acoustic signature. The principles are similar: reduce detectability during the critical period when the enemy is searching for targets. The technology is vastly more sophisticated, but the tactical thinking follows the same logic Mountbatten employed in 1940. The scientific study of camouflage has advanced considerably since 1940. Researchers now understand color perception, lighting conditions, and human visual psychology with precision that would astonish wartime observers. This knowledge confirms the Admiralty's skepticism. Mountbatten Pink could not have worked as advertised except under very specific conditions. The theoretical window of effectiveness was even narrower than critics suggested. But it also confirms that within that narrow window, the approach had merit. Modern research into animal camouflage has revealed sophisticated strategies that evolution has developed over millions of years. Many of these strategies were unknowingly approximated by wartime camouflage designers. The principle of background matching, which Mountbatten Pink attempted to exploit, is fundamental to how many animals avoid predation. But successful background matching requires precise control over color, pattern, behavior, and environmental conditions. In nature, animals that rely on this strategy are highly specialized to specific environments. Mountbatten was attempting to apply a specialized strategy to vessels that operated across varied conditions. Consider what Mountbatten achieved, despite the ultimate failure of his camouflage scheme. He identified a genuine tactical problem. Dawn and dusk attacks were real threats. He proposed a solution based on careful observation. He implemented that solution using available resources and authority. He gathered feedback from operational experience. When formal analysis contradicted his approach, the Admiralty made the correct decision to discontinue it. This was not failure. This was the process of innovation working correctly. The war demanded constant experimentation. Technologies, tactics, and strategies evolved rapidly. What worked in 1940 became obsolete by 1942. Mountbatten Pink represented one attempt among thousands to gain tactical advantage. Most experiments failed or provided marginal benefits. A few succeeded dramatically and changed the course of the war. The challenge was distinguishing between the two quickly enough to matter. This is the fundamental challenge of wartime innovation. Resources are limited. Time is limited. The enemy is adapting simultaneously. Organizations must encourage experimentation while also maintaining discipline to discontinue failed experiments quickly. The Admiralty's handling of Mountbatten Pink, while not perfect, demonstrated this balance reasonably well. They allowed the experiment to proceed. They gathered evidence about its effectiveness. They made a decision based on that evidence despite the personal prestige of the officer who championed the approach. Mountbatten's career continued despite the failure of his signature camouflage. He rose to become Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia. He oversaw the recapture of Burma and the defeat of Japanese forces in the region. After the war, he served as the last Viceroy of India, managing the complex and tragic partition of the subcontinent. He became First Sea Lord and Chief of the Defense Staff. His legacy far exceeded a controversial paint scheme. But the pink ships remained part of his story, a reminder that innovation requires accepting the risk of failure. Mountbatten's post-war career demonstrated that failed innovations need not define an officer's reputation. His willingness to experiment, to challenge conventional thinking, to accept risk in pursuit of advantage, these qualities served him well throughout his career. The pink ships showed these qualities even if they didn't provide tactical benefits. Organizations that punish all failures discourage the experimentation that produces genuine breakthroughs. The sailors who served on pink ships never forgot them. They formed associations and held reunions. They shared memories of those strange destroyers that looked like they'd been painted for a garden party, but fought in the deadliest war in human history. They defended the color against critics, insisting it had saved them even when evidence suggested otherwise. This loyalty transcended rational analysis. It spoke to deeper human needs for meaning, protection, and belief in purpose. The veteran associations that formed after the war served important social and psychological functions. They allowed men who had shared extraordinary experiences to maintain connections with others who understood what they had endured. For veterans of ships like HMS Kenya and HMS Kenya, the pink paint became a badge of identity. They had served on distinctive vessels. They had participated in famous operations. Their service mattered. The color, whatever its tactical value, symbolized these deeper truths. Mountbatten Pink failed as camouflage, but succeeded as a demonstration of the innovation required during desperate times. Britain in 1940 faced existential threat. Every officer, every sailor, every citizen had to think creatively about survival. Traditional approaches were insufficient. New ideas, even unusual ideas, deserved serious consideration. Some would fail, but the process of testing them was essential. The story teaches us that technological innovation during warfare is messy, imperfect, and often disappointing. But it is also necessary. Organizations that refuse to experiment, that cling rigidly to established practice, that punish failure too harshly, these organizations lose. They lose to enemies who are willing to take risks, who learn from failures, who adapt faster. Mountbatten Pink was a failed experiment.